Wilkes and his initial expedition ships, Vincennes, Peacock, Porpoise, Seagull, Flying Fish, and Relief, weighed anchor and set sail from Hampton Roads, Virginia, on their way to the Madeira Islands near Spain at 3 in the afternoon on 18 August 1838, under favorable conditions. Wilkes recalled the moment when he passed Cape Henry Lighthouse. The day was beautiful, the sea smooth, the wind light, and the squadron around, with the land sinking from our view. On their way to Madeira, Wilkes took scientific measurements of the currents, while others began catching fish and classifying them. Wilkes and his ships arrived on the 16th of September. He noted in his official narrative of the dark and gloomy atmosphere, the distant mountain scenery, jagged ridges, and sharp pyramids of rock gave off to the naked eye. Once on the island, the view improved among the quaint villages between the large mountains. The scientific corps set about collecting specimens while there. Dana and Holmes, among others, examined a bed of fossils on the east end of the island. Most inhabitants of the island busy themselves in the industry of wine, their chief export and source of income. Like other locations they would visit, they took careful notations of the people and the languages they spoke. Wilkes left Madeira on the 25th of September to make the long journey to Rio de Janeiro, using the equatorial current. Along the long track to South America, they stopped for soundings, or the process of taking measurements of the depths of sea or a body of water, at the Cape Verde Islands near the coast of West Africa. They passed the magnetic equator on the 16th of November before arriving in the beautiful harbors of Rio on the 23rd of November 1838. Looking at the pleasant peaks of Gavia and Sugarloaf onto the city of San Salvador, the view formed, quote, such a scene that it would be difficult to point out in what manner it could be improved. Artists Alfred T. Agate and Joseph Drayton were busy sketching the local tribes of the region, noting the intricate tattoos that distinguish each other and the different groups of people. Even Lieutenant Wilkes drew some of the scenery in Rio. The expedition stayed in Rio de Janeiro until the new year, mostly due to some much-needed repairs on USS Peacock, departing on the 6th of January and traveling south towards Buenos Aires. They arrived at Rio Negro on 25th January, observing the local cultures of the Patagonians in Argentina. The next stop was Tierra del Fuego on 20 January 1839, with the rest of the squadron joining the Relief, Flying Fish, and Seagull in Orange Harbor there on the 19th of February. It was there, amongst the native Fuegians, that Wilkes sent a smaller expedition of ships south in an attempt to exceed British explorer Captain Cook's farthest point south, at 71 degrees 10 minutes latitude. The attempt failed due to poor weather and the approaching southern winter, so the expedition regrouped and focused up the west coast of South America. During that failed attempt, they did rename a new area about 100 miles north of Thurston Island, calling it Cape Flying Fish after the U.S. naval vessel USS Flying Fish. Passing through Cape Horn, artist Alfred Agate took the time to paint the beautiful rock formation in view of the water where the Atlantic Ocean touches the Great Southern or Pacific Ocean. Traveling up the coast of South America, they visited Valparaíso in the country of Chile in May. One of the officers noted a strong abundance of apples, pears, peaches, cherries, grapes, strawberries, oranges, and vegetables there. Sadly, at this time, USS Seagull and her entire crew of 15 were lost off the coast. Wilkes lamented their loss greatly, taking particular care to write in his narrative of the greatest confidence he had in the officers and crew. Despite the loss, the squadron continued up the coast of South America, arriving in San Lorenzo, off Callao, on 6 June for much-needed repairs before venturing into the Pacific. It was there that Wilkes ordered USS Relief, which almost sank off Noir Island in the Tierra del Fuego, home with the sick and malcontents, though mostly it was officers and men who he felt personally opposed him and his leadership abilities. While in Peru, The scientists busied themselves surveying the surrounding terrain, notably the picturesque Andes Mountains. The expedition left South America, provisioned and devoid of Wilkes troublemakers, on 13 July. Their primary mission of charting the lesser-known islands of the Pacific could finally begin. The expedition visited Reao Island and the Tamato Archipelago in French Polynesia on 13 August. Using ships at sea and fixed points on shore, Wilkes' team began surveying the coralline islands and wide lagoons. The scientific corps busied themselves once again ashore, collecting specimens and conversing with the island inhabitants. Unfortunately, the islanders grew restless of their new friends, threatening them with force to leave the island. Due to the fear of hostility, Wilkes rarely let the scientists leave the confines of their ships after this, forming the beginning of discontent between the expedition commander and the scientific corps that would last for the remainder of the cruise. Angered by the involuntary isolation, naturalist Titian Peale wrote in his diary, "What was a scientific corps for?" The Naval Survey crew was more successful in their endeavors, surveying 16 islands in the remainder of that month. Sailing further into French Polynesia, Wilkes arrived in Tahiti in the middle of September 1839. The island topography, meaning its natural and physical features, differed greatly from the previous island chain they visited. Instead of coral-lined beaches, Tahiti was described as a whole island of volcanic formation, with basaltic ridges reaching the sea at intervals. The large amount of avian or bird activity on Tahiti was very characteristic of South Pacific islands. The expedition spent approximately 3 weeks in Tahiti. Wilkes was generous and allowed more scientific expeditions ashore because the island inhabitants were friendlier and more receptive upon their arrival. The inhabitants used more advanced double canoes alongside traditional ones for fishing and trading around the island chain. The islanders' clothing was made out of tapa, a cloth-like material made from the bark of the mulberry tree. At the Samoan Islands in October 1839, Wilkes and his team got to observe the art of tattoo as a form of male initiation, a ritual that exists still to this day. Samoa was a critical island chain to study and chart because of its importance in the whaling and trade industries. An observatory was set up on the island, staffed by a single sailor to make astrological observations. Leaving Samoa, Wilkes decided to cut short the next planned expedition stop at Fiji to prepare for the historic Antarctic voyage by way of Australia, as it was necessary to travel the southernmost point of the globe in the upcoming warmer summer months. Ships arrived in Sydney at the end of November 1839. In preparation of their next foray, ship crews spent their time in Australia, resupplying and making repairs. While there, they were greeted by the island's inhabitants who marveled at the American ships that would travel in the frigid Antarctic Circle. The crew were also delighted to hit the town of Sydney and feel familiar with a culture and language similar to their own. While in Australia, Wilkes allowed the scientists to remain in warmer climates, even extending an olive branch to soothe their wounded relationship by funding scientific excursions in Australia and New Zealand. They took them up on the offer and avoided the Antarctic. Scientific corps members like Alfred Gate and Joseph Hale documented the Aboriginal population of Australia, the original inhabitants of the land. After a pleasant Christmas in Sydney, the squadron departed for Antarctic waters on 26 December 1839 at the height of the area's summer season. They departed with 10 months of provisions for a likely 3-month voyage in case they were trapped in ice or faced harsh conditions at the southern edge of the world. They spotted their first icebergs on 10 January 1840. Soon, they formed giant barriers that prevented passage further south. Moving west, they looked for an opening. Soon, they reported mountains from several ships and the discovery of an Antarctic continent west of the Balleny Islands. Marine Quartermaster Sergeant Simeon Stern mentioned sighting land in his diary early in the morning of the 19th of January. From his position, he noted that the land appeared, quote, high and mountainous. The area was later known as Wilkes Land, named after Charles Wilkes. The harsh temperatures and bitter rain took a toll on the crew. Heavy fogs forced much of the expedition to separate and fall behind schedule, on their way to the Antarctic. USS Flying Fish, with their smaller crew of 8, became separated from the group at the beginning of the year, eventually making it to Antarctica and aimlessly floating among the icebergs with its mostly sick crew before turning back to safety in early February. USS Peacock was almost lost when it hit large blocks of ice, crashing into a large ice table on 24 January. Thankfully, the tired crew alongside carpenters were able to steer the ship into open water and save it, which soon returned to Sydney for an overhaul. USS Porpoise and Wilkes' flagship Vincennes continued charting and exploring into February, arriving back and regrouping at the Bay of Islands in New Zealand in the middle of March. Despite these harsh conditions, Wilkes accomplished much. They covered 1,500 miles of new territory and established Antarctica as a bona fide continent. With the scientists in tow, the remaining sailors, marines, and scientists attached to the expedition departed for Tonga. There, Wilkes spent most of the time charting the island shoals. The scientists noticed the many physical differences among the islands here compared to the rest they encountered in the South Pacific. Their next stop on their voyage to Fiji from May to August 1840 began the most tumultuous of their 4 years at sea. While on Fiji, inland expeditions gathered 750 plant specimens, 118 examples of new coral species, and over 1,200 artifacts of their survey of the island. They also observed the local religious practices of the Fijians, including their musical prowess. Marine Sergeant Simeon Stearns had this to say about the Fijian drums. Fiji drums are the most important of the Fijian musical instruments. It is hit with 2 sticks, perhaps 2 war clubs on the opposite sides. The sound thus produces is not dissimilar to that made by beating on an empty barrel, though perhaps of a deeper tone. Stearns went on to say that the drums could be heard as far as 2 miles. Unfortunately, these scientific and anthropological endeavors came at a price while on Fiji. In July, 2 members of the expedition party, Lieutenant Joseph Underwood and Midshipman Wilkes Henry, nephew to Charles Wilkes, were killed while bartering for food in the western Fijian island of Malolo. The crew were able to recover the bodies, but the news broke Wilkes into fits of angry tears. The expedition landed 60 sailors and marines to attack the hostile natives in the native villages, causing many losses for the native Fijians during the attack. For those who witnessed the battle, it was a sight they would never forget for the rest of their lives. A naval monument at Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, is dedicated to the loss of the 2 men on Fiji and the men aboard USS Seagull who were lost at sea off Cape Horn in 1839. After the stress of the Fiji Islands, the scientists looked for normalcy in their work at their next stop in Hawaii, beginning in September 1840. Dana, the geologist, did massive amounts of work on Hawaiian volcanoes while there. He ascended the summit of Mauna Loa, where they established a magnetic observatory. On 5 April 1841, Wilkes left Honolulu to begin their journey back to the United States to survey North America's northwest coastline, the other main goal of the great and expansive undertaking. Although Wilkes was brilliant, the resentment of his leadership stoked in the earliest parts of the voyage only got worse. Navy Lieutenant William Reynolds called him a, quote, false and malignant villain. The situation amongst the crew and their leader, unfortunately, would not improve, despite the extraordinary amount of scientific work collected and cataloged throughout the voyage. Part 3 finishes the journey of the Wilkes expedition from 1841 to 1842 and discusses the lasting legacy of the historic voyage that still survives today.